Khan was appointed as Special Rapporteur by the UN Human Rights Council in July 2020. She is the first woman to hold this position since the establishment of the mandate in 1993. Prior to this position, she was Secretary General of Amnesty International from 2001 to 2009 and Director General of the International Development Law Organization from 2012 to 2019. In the past 10 days, from 23 January to 2 February, Ms. Khan conducted an official country visit to the Philippines at the invitation of the government of the Philippines to assess the state of freedom of opinion and expression in the country. In this context, Ms. Khan has met with a wide range of stakeholders, from state officials to civil society, media workers, the international community, and many others. She traveled to Metro Manila, Baguio City, Tacloban, and Cebu City. This morning, she will share her preliminary findings and recommendations. She will present a full report on her visit to the Human Rights Council in June 2025. So without further ado, Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, Ms. Irene Khan.
Thank you everyone, and thank you for waiting. I will just open my notes so I can start the statement. As you heard, I've been here now for about 12 days and have had very intense discussions with the government, with civil society, with the Supreme Court, with Parliament, with some of your members of your House of Representatives, and also with the National Human Rights Commission. And I'll be happy to tell you more about those exact conversations in a minute. I am very fortunate to be coming to Philippines at a critical moment for the country. The administration of President Marcos Jr. has set a new tone on many issues that were of concern in the recent past. The decision to reopen the peace talks, the release of former Senator Laila de Lima, the acquittal of Nobel laureate Maria Ressa on tax fraud charges are all positive signals. And at the international level, as you may know, the administration is seeking a greater leadership role. It chairs the UN Commission on the Status of Women this year. It has made a bid for the Security Council in 2027 to 2028. And it has shown a greater willingness than the previous regime to engage with the special procedures. I should just mention that the special procedures of the United Nations are not employees. They are not accountable to the Secretariat. We are appointed by member states, by governments of the UN Human Rights Council, governments like the Philippines, and we therefore have a mandate to visit countries, to report on what is happening there within the remit of our mandate, and to suggest recommendations. We are independent experts. And in the last 22 years, there have been 10 special rapporteurs who have visited the Philippines, who have been invited to visit the Philippines. I am the third special rapporteur to visit the country officially since this administration came to power. So there is a willingness to engage with the UN. These are all positive signals, but they are not sufficient to turn the page decisively on the past. Tackling the grave and deep-seated human rights problems of the Philippines, many of which are related to my mandate, will require more fundamental and sustained reforms and also a clear commitment to accountability. At home and abroad, there is an expectation that the government will build on the steps it has already taken to make more significant legal, policy, and institutional changes. And it is only by doing that it will reaffirm the image of the Philippines as a forward-looking, vibrant democracy committed to human rights and the rule of law. Now, let me turn to some key findings and recommendations, and after that, I'll be happy to answer your questions. The first one is in relation to civil society and the media sector. As you know, Philippines has a vibrant civil society and media sector. I will not give you the numbers that I have here, but they are very impressive. I have visited Baguio, and I saw the open, inclusive, accountable approach to civil society there. But when government affirms the critical and legitimate role of human rights defenders and journalists, the journalists and human rights defenders actually can operate in the space they need. They can work safely and effectively. And I call upon the executive and the House of Representatives at the national level to expedite a law on the protection of human rights defenders. I have been encouraged by other initiatives like the Open Government Initiative that brings in civil society into the development process. But having noted these positive elements, I must also express grave concerns that civil society actors and many journalists face. During my various meetings with civil society, I heard again and again complaints about red tagging, terror tagging, which is the branding of people, of individuals or groups as supporters, recruiters, and members of the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army. Many of them, human rights defenders, humanitarian workers, teachers, youth, priests, health workers, indigenous leaders, claim to have been or are being targeted. Many of the victims of the vilification are young, articulate women. Many of the victims have pointed their fingers at the state agency, the NTF-LCAC, either as the culprit or the instigator, but also to the military, state security officials, senior government officials, and some media outlets linked to political figures. Sometimes the attacks are online and not clearly identifiable. The practice, of course, is not new. As we know, this has been happening in the past and was particularly intensified online and offline under the presidency of President Duterte, especially with the creation at that time of NTF-LCAC. And it has been reported by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the past. It has been reported by the National Human Rights Commission here, and several international organizations, and by the ILO high-level mission that was here earlier last year. And the government, I have asked the government openly whether they have a policy on red tagging, and I was reassured that it does not encourage or endorse it. But there is clear evidence that red tagging and terror tagging are being practiced by security forces as part of their counterterrorism strategy. And it is also clear that often such vilification is not aimed at those who are actually associated with these proscribed organizations, as some of the officials have actually claimed. It is targeting legitimate activists, sowing distrust between the state, communities, and civil society. And the dangers are evident. The vilification has often been followed by threats, unlawful surveillance, attacks, or even unlawful killing. It intimidates and chills freedom of expression. It suppresses legal activism. It isolates and antagonizes those who are unfairly attacked, puts them in a vulnerable position, and undermines public trust in civil society and the media. I have seen that also in the context of academic freedom. Teachers and educators have pointed out to me that by labeling them as communists or terrorists, their opinions and insights are devalued. They are at a risk of being dismissed without any consideration. And this has a detrimental effect on the quality of the education system. Campus journalists, students have complained of the way in which security forces are seeking to enter campuses and undermine the autonomy of academic freedom. Critically reporting on state policies, informing the public about the state of the insurgency, documenting or speaking out against human rights violations, working in the community to reduce the economic and social injustices that are at the root of violent extremism are all legitimate activities, both under international law and under Philippines law. In a democratic society, yes, the state certainly has the obligation to protect its people from terrorism, but it must do so within the confines of the rule of law and in line with its international human rights obligations. And so I've made 3 recommendations in relation to red tagging. First, the government says it doesn't have a policy on red tagging. Good. The government doesn't have a policy on corruption, but the government has a policy on anti-corruption, on fighting corruption. And I have called on the government to adopt a policy on fighting red tagging. I have recommended an executive order denouncing this practice and setting out very clear measures that can be taken to discourage, disincentivize, and discipline those who violate the policy. Second, I've encouraged the National Human Rights Commission to speed up its work that it is now doing to define red tagging and to propose a legislation. Third, NTFLCAC was established about 6 years ago in a different context. It is outdated. It does not take into account the ongoing prospects for peace negotiations. I therefore recommend that the task force should be abolished. The abolition will not only address some of the most critical drivers of red tagging, but it will also allow this administration to modernize peace-building approaches based on this changing political landscape. The abolition will allow for a more inclusive peacemaking platform or platforms with participation of women peacemakers and communities as a genuine whole-of-nation approach to peace. My second findings or group of findings are in relation to media freedom and the safety of journalists and human rights defenders. You gentlemen and ladies who are here are not only my channel of communications, you are also my constituency. The killing of journalists is the most egregious form of censorship, and the Philippines remains a dangerous country for journalists. According to UNESCO, there are some 81 cases of killings of journalists that remain to be resolved. That is, they have not been investigated, prosecuted. Clearly, much more needs to be done to attack impunity. Violence against journalists and human rights defenders, as we all know, was particularly high during the Duterte administration. However, the past 18 months shows that the trend remains disturbing, with 4 journalists killed since the new administration took office. I've been told by the Department of Justice that they have prosecuted 3 cases and are investigating the 4th. And the Department of Justice has also taken some other measures to strengthen investigation and prosecution. However, the main issue here, of course, is what is known as this AO35 mechanism, which brings in all the various agencies of the government together to address impunity. And AO35 needs to be strengthened because impunity for killings still remains a major problem. We must not forget accountability for past victims, justice for past victims of the past. Let me now move through. I will not have time to get through everything, but I'm open to your questions. On media freedom and the right to information, the current administration appears to be more amiable towards the press than the previous one. However, the damage caused by the previous administration has reduced media pluralism and public trust in independent journalism because of the viral disinformation and troll campaigns. Aside from killings and libel cases against critical journalists, the non-renewal of the franchise of CBN, one of the country's largest broadcasting television and radio network in 2020, was a major blow to media freedom. We've raised concerns about it in the past, but of course non-renewal of the franchise continues to adversely affect independent and diverse media and the Filipino people's access to plural information today. I have found the current procedures to form a broadcast media outlet in the Philippines cumbersome, far more cumbersome than good practice. And I encourage the authorities to look into it and make it easier for media professionals to operate. I also believe that the authorities should look into the issue of media ownership monopoly and adopt rules aiming at limiting the disproportionate influence of a single person or entity. In the course of my visit, first of all, I should, of course, acknowledge that the sector is very diverse with many, many outlets, 2,123 private media outlets, 395 AM stations, 1,090 FM stations, 546 TV stations, and 92 newspaper titles operate in the country. But at the same time, I was informed about the blocking of alternative news organizations online because of allegations about their links to terror rebellion. And the blocking of websites is a direct form of censorship which requires a high degree of scrutiny. The government may dislike some outlets that provide alternative narratives that may not follow its own editorial line, but it is critical that any decision to restrict freedom of expression meets the what we call the three-part test at the international level: legality, necessity, proportionality. And it should be supervised, it should have independent supervision and decision-making by the courts. Now, in the Philippines, the right to information has been operationalized by the Executive Order Number 2 of July 2016. And while it has affirmed people's right to information, there is a very long list of exceptions which make it difficult for you as journalists or for citizens to inform themselves, to access information. And I have called for legislation, a proper adoption of a law in line with international standards for access to information. I have also asked, there is a plan on action for the safety of journalists, which is a multi-stakeholder consultation arrangement in partnership with UNESCO, which is being implemented by the National Human Rights Commission, and I have suggested that the government should also work closely with it and support it. There is a media welfare bill in Congress, as you know, and while the initiative is positive, I would recommend that Congress conduct broader consultations with media sector to gauge the likely impact of the bill, particularly on smaller outlets. I have asked for certain legal reforms. I'm aware that the Constitution of the Philippines provides a very broad right to freedom of expression. However, there are certain laws that are of concern from the international standards point of view. One law is the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, which in our view does not meet international law standards. We raised it with the government previously. Of course, the Supreme Court judgment has come out where they have reflected, their decision matches with a couple of our concerns, but there are many concerns that remain, in particular warrantless arrests and the warrantless searches and detention without a warrant for a period of time. These are issues that we will be discussing with the Supreme Court, commenting on the Supreme Court's new guidelines that have been issued. And so this will be a continuous conversation with the Philippine government to see how we can encourage them to align their law with international standards. The other issue that I have raised is Cybercrime Prevention Act of 2012, which was designed originally to prosecute offenses such as cyber squatting, cyber sex, child pornography, but has been used to deadly effect against journalists, chilling freedom of expression, chilling media freedom, and particularly the cyber libel provisions. And I have recommended that they be repealed, along with criminal libel in your criminal code. Criminalization of speech for libel is actually going out of fashion around the world. Several developing countries in Africa, for example, the courts have called on the government to repeal the laws. They have been described as relics of the colonial past. A modern democracy does not need to criminalize expression. There are provisions under the civil law for civil suits. The power of the state should not be brought to bear on one side in an issue where the interests of both sides are private. Our reputation is our private business. We should not be able, one side, the powerful side usually, should not be able to call on the resources of the state to protect it, while the other side is left without protection. And the other side very often are journalists like you. I have also concluded by congratulating Philippines for the cooperation it has shown with the United Nations, and also the pledges that were made on behalf of the President on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is a pledge to release soon the National Human Rights Plan of the Philippines, the 5th National Human Rights Plan, and I have asked for freedom of expression to be put front and center in that plan, because without freedom of expression, you cannot exercise or enjoy civil and political rights or economic, social, and cultural rights, from elections to education to the environment. You need to have freedom of expression and the right to information. I have also encouraged the government to continue to work with the United Nations in the Joint Action Plan on Human Rights that they have been working on over the past year, which has led to greater engagement with civil society, greater engagement of the government with civil society on key issues like addressing impunity, addressing media freedom issues, and so on. So I think the partnership has been very fruitful. The government would now like to set up a Human Rights Coordinating Council to sustain these initiatives. I encourage them to do so, but to seek the support of the United Nations. The international community is ready to support Philippines, to strengthen its human rights, and to ensure that Philippines goes back to its past glory, the glory of Philippines as one of the very few Asian states that actually signed the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So Philippines has a great history. However, whether steps will be made, whether meaningful steps will be made towards reaffirming Philippines' human rights commitments depends on political will. And that is where public opinion comes in. That is where your reporting comes in. How much will the people of the Philippines put pressure on its government to deliver? Thank you very much.
30 minutes, you're okay? Do you want to take 3 questions at a time or 1 question at a time?
I can start. Let's see how we go.
Okay.
Hi, ma'am.
Hello.
I'm Jim from the Associated Press. Ma'am, you've noted some improvements in the human rights conditions in the Philippines, and also expressed grave concern over, things that you have found out during your stay. So, my first of 2 questions is, using standards of the United Nations on human rights, would you say that the situation now in the Philippines is acceptable or not?
Well, obviously, some changes have been made, but I have also said in my report that it is not enough. I think the government is trying to change the page, and turning the page will require more to be done. The signs are good. It's like the sun rising in the morning, but it's the rest of the day that will count as to whether it will be sunny or rainy.
Are those compliance enough for in regard to the UN standards on human rights?
The UN standards are actually obligations that this government has itself written. Treaties, UN resolutions. Philippines is an active member of the United Nations. It has signed up to human rights treaties. It is a party to most of the key treaties. It was a key player in the development of the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So these are treaties that belong to Philippines. We are only asking Philippines to live up to its own legal obligations, the obligations that it has towards its own citizens.
And my second question, ma'am, is you've noted the prevalence of impunity by state actors in the Philippines. So how crucial is it for this administration to return to the fold of the ICC?
I can't really address that because the ICC, of course, is a totally different agency. It is up to Philippines to decide which way it wants to go. However, what is absolutely non-negotiable is the question of justice for those who lost their life, for their families. They must have justice. There must be accountability for the state itself to strengthen its foundations of democracy, of trust with its citizens. It has to address what has happened in the past. You can't just sweep it under the carpet. We see that around the world. So Philippines should learn from what has happened, including in this region, when impunity for past crimes are not addressed.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Can you say something about the calls to have Frenchie May Cumpio freed?
Well, as you know, I actually visited Frenchie May and her Marielle and Alexander in detention, and I'm grateful to the government for giving me the permission to visit them. I think our delegation was the only international delegation that was allowed to meet with them. And they were in high spirits. I was very impressed. It was almost inspiring to see these young people, 3 young people arrested at the age of 21, still languishing in prison. Francie had just celebrated her 25th birthday. They had been in prison for 4 years. And justice delayed is justice denied. Terrorism charges have been brought against them, very serious, non-bailable charges. And either the government, I hope, after my visit, the government authorities will look into those cases, review the case and dismiss the charges, or bring them to trial rapidly with full due process so that it can be decided whether or not they are guilty. To leave them to languish, to leave young people like that, inspiring, articulate, resilient young people in prison, sends a terrible message for the youth of this country.
Hi, ma'am. Good afternoon. John Vic Mateo, Philippine Star. What was the government's response to your recommendations regarding red tagging, particularly the issuance of the executive order and the abolition of NTF-LCAC?
Well, the government officially was, of course, represented at the meeting by the Department of Foreign Affairs, because that is through whom we channel our reports. And the government has said that what I have shared with them are my preliminary observations. And since my official report will not be discussed in the UN until next year, I've also offered that in this interim period, we should keep discussing, dialoguing with them to see how these recommendations can be adopted. So the government welcomed all the report, and the government has said that they will be having discussions with me. They will make comments on it. I cannot, of course, speak for NTF-LCAC. I think you should ask them how they feel about it, and I think you will get an answer.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My question is, one of the contentions until now of the over 30 petitioners against the new law, the anti-terror law of the Philippines, is that the provision of warrantless arrest is really unconstitutional. For you, ma'am, considering international standard, it is really, on its face, it is really unconstitutional or baseless?
Well, the the Supreme Court looked at the law in the abstract. All these petitions that were made was asking for the Supreme Court to say, look at this text and tell us whether it meets your constitution or not. I think, as you know, of course, more people, I believe more complaints, actual complaints of misuse of the law are going up through the system. And in my discussions with the Supreme Court, I got the impression that they will consider the cases as they come. And those cases will, in my view, highlight the weaknesses in the system, the absence of due process, that if you can make a warrantless search, what risks it creates, where there are many situations, as we know, cases where the courts have found that there were trumped-up charges, the evidence was planted. How do you protect people from that kind of a situation? If their detention takes place without a warrant, and that is then extended without judicial scrutiny, what happens? I've been told, and there is in the law, it says a judge will be informed. And I've been told that opens up the possibility for the judge to investigate, to look into various complaints. Well, let's see. I believe that terrorism is a serious crime. The state should act to protect people against it, but the state should not be breaking rules in order to do that. Within those rules, there are many countries who have arranged, for example, special judicial scrutiny, fast special judicial scrutiny for arrest of those who are going to be charged with terrorism, special tribunals that review warrants very fast. And those kinds of protections, I think there's a lot that the Philippines can learn from other countries that have gone through similar situations and apply it here.
Hi, ma'am. Good morning. Jairo po from Rappler. You mentioned earlier that one of your recommendations is to strengthen the AO35 of the Philippine government, which is a task force investigating the extrajudicial killings and heinous crimes. What specifically are your recommendations? And earlier, the DOJ mentioned that they're seeking to include the prosecutors in the case build-up. Specifically, what are your recommendations to strengthen this mechanism, especially that we saw that some of the cases filed by the AO35 were actually dismissed under the current government?
That's right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, I think what the DOJ is talking about, and what I think also needs to happen, is better coordination between the investigators and prosecutors, where investigators don't really have strong evidence, and they're bringing it up, prosecutors are taking it to court, and the court is throwing it out. So the DOJ is interested in increasing its conviction rate. At the moment, its conviction rate, I'm told, is somewhere in the 20s, and they would like to bring it up to at least the 70s. In order to do that, they have to get more efficient about their investigation and build up better cases. Through cooperation with the United Nations, the Department of Justice is setting up a forensic training institute that will definitely help. But my experience with killings of journalists and political killings is that a number of different government agencies have to be involved. This AO35 has over 200 or so, more than 200, well over 200 cases that it has been investigating. And that's just not sufficient. They're not working hard enough. That's basically what I'm saying. They're not working hard enough, and they need to produce results.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Victoria of ABS-CBN. Ma'am, you said earlier that the Philippines has to live up to its obligations in following the treaties that it signed. But what if it doesn't? Can the UN impose sanctions? Thank you.
Well, what happens, for example, is very often it is peer pressure. The UN treaties and obligations are enforced through peer pressure. Just as Philippines participates in processes that put pressure on others, others will participate in processes to put pressure on Philippines to up its standards. And also, I believe that there is an internal domestic imperative now. The President has laid out an ambitious agenda for engagement with the United Nations, for Philippines' leadership of international bodies, the UN Commission on the Status of Women, membership of the Security Council coming up. That's a very responsible position, and that therefore puts some onus on the government to up its standards. It can hardly be a UN Security Council member and be unable or not manage its own security problems in line with UN standards. So it has a real opportunity now to show that it can be a role model in what it is doing at home that gives it stronger moral authority to play a larger role abroad.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Mikhail of Reuters. You've made several recommendations, but between now and when you present your findings next year, which would you put greater weight on in terms of being able to better assess that the Philippines has indeed turned the page going forward? And second question, would you recommend the extension of the joint program between the Philippines and the UN, which is scheduled to end this year? Perhaps a new iteration or an extension of the existing mechanism, given the assessment that you just made?
Well, the existing mechanism is a co-convening between the UN and the government of the Philippines, and linked to it was, in the early stages, some reporting to the Human Rights Council. There is no requirement now for reporting back to the Human Rights Council. But one of the big achievements, I'm told, about this joint plan of action has been bringing civil society to the table with the government. And it took 18 months to agree on the names that were being proposed by the UN. So it has taken some time. I think both sides are just at the beginning of building that trust in each other so that they can sit around the table. And of course, though the numbers that of civil society that have been invited in needs to be broadened. There needs to be more diversity among it. People with whom the government may agree, people with whom the government may not agree, but they all need to be in the room. That's the process, and that takes time. And therefore, my recommendation is that whatever label you put on this program, it is very important that the UN continues to play a role, continues to provide its expertise and its credibility to the process, so that both sides feel comfortable to come around the table. That takes a time. So there's a transition there. So I've requested the government to consider continuing this very important partnership that it has developed with the UN.
Hello, ma'am. Barnaby Lowe of Al Jazeera. I wonder if you have any thoughts on a couple of significant stories that happened during the course of your visit. One is that the DOJ junked perjury charges against environmental activists Jed Tamano and Janila Castro, but charged them with slander. And the other one is the closure of CNN Philippines. Of course, it was a business decision, but within 24 hours of closure, we saw how everything was wiped out from its websites, all of the news articles, stories, videos, everything wiped out within 24 hours.
Well, let me start with the DOJ case. I don't know the merits of what actually happened or didn't happen in the background of these young women. But what I find extremely worrying, disturbing, is that the state brings a defamation case because of a complaint against the state. It's a security agency, I think, complaint against the security agencies, the military. Now, that is going to put a dampening effect on others who will be afraid, who may have different background from these young women. But who is going to go and complain about the police beating them up if the police then turn around and threaten to sue you for libel? And this is why I'm saying criminal libel, the role of the state should not come in and equate itself with the citizen. The state is there to protect us. And therefore, I think it's a very bad move. It will chill complaints, genuine complaints, all kinds of complaints, from people. And people, how can people trust state agencies if the state is just waiting to catch you out? Do you have the resources? You'll be paying out of your pocket. Those young women will be paying out of their pocket to defend themselves in the libel case. The government will be taking taxpayers' money to defend itself. I think there's something terribly unfair in a democratic state in that situation. With regard to CNN Philippines, it is indeed a very worrying sign. Media sector is a troubled sector in many countries of the world, and in my view, making decisions or treating the media sector as a commercial sector alone is wrong. Media is a public good. It's a public service, regardless of whether you're profit, non-profit, or independent. You are providing, if you're news media, you're providing very important information to the public, allowing public debate. And that is something, and that is therefore, the state needs to look into this sector. I've talked about the regulation of ownership, because what is happening in many countries, including in the Philippines, that powerful economic and political interests are coming in to buy media, and that sometimes lead to a direct erosion of media freedom, of editorial freedom. So media has to be free, independent, diverse, and pluralistic, according to understanding at the international level. And it is the state's responsibility to ensure that happens. Not that the state should run in and manage, because you don't want that either, but it should create an environment that enables media freedom, independence, pluralism, and diversity. And what the CNN channel proves is that even though the decision may have been commercial, a lot of other real important factors are coming in now that will deprive people of a valid information source. I should also stress one thing in my report, which I did mention to the government, and you should know, and that is that freedom of expression is about debate. It is about dissent. It is about dialogue. It is about criticism. And therefore, on the other side, the duty bearer, the state, has to show tolerance. There are things that it will not like that are being said. There's criticism that it will not like. But the whole concept of freedom of expression is to be able to say what you want, even if it offends the other side. And similarly, for you to listen to what someone else is saying that is offensive. And therefore, there should be a greater culture. The state, the government, should encourage a greater culture of tolerance. And that is as true of the case of these young women who are now being charged with defamation as it is of newspapers that are writing things that the government doesn't like, or student journalists and students who are marching out and protesting on things. So tolerance is a very important quality for the state in order to protect and uphold freedom of expression.
Ma'am, good afternoon. I'm Joanna Balyaran from GG Press here. Good afternoon. Ma'am, of course, there are efforts from the government to protect journalists, and one of those is the formation of the Presidential Task Force on Media Security. Did you have the time to look into their performance, and if ever, how would you assess the performance of the PT FOMs over the past years, and were they able to live up to their mandate to protect journalists?
Well, I think in the context of protection or prevention of attacks, I feel that there is no proper system for that. There are ad hoc efforts. PT Forms has made individual démarches in a few cases. PT Form has sent out a circular to police stations asking the police public information officers to play the role of media security vanguards, I think it is called. But that's not enough. And I'm talking from experience in other parts of the world. In October, I was in Honduras, which also is a very dangerous country for journalists. I've been to Mexico and places like that where many journalists are killed. And I've looked at the kind of efforts the governments have made there to set up protection mechanisms. And there is a lot. A journalist a few years ago was shot in the middle of the day on the street in Amsterdam. And within 6 months, 3 months, the case had been investigated. Within 7 days, they had arrested someone. They followed through, and they made sure that everyone knew that not to try that again. And of course, journalists walk every day on the streets of Amsterdam. So there is a lot more it has to be systematic, institutionalized, resourced properly. And as journalists, you have to feel confident about approaching that protection mechanism. From what I have heard, many journalists are actually afraid of the police. They're afraid of the security system. So asking you to go to the same police that may have tagged you or brought false charges against you is not going to work.
Hello, my name is Kaoru Okada from Daily Manila Shimbun, Japanese media. I would like to know that your findings this time here in the Philippines is really things like you think confined in the Philippines or something other somewhere happening in other world, other part of the world.
Well, I'm sorry to say the Philippines is not unique in some of these problems. There are countries that are worse and there are countries that are better. I'm going to ask my colleague to tell me where Philippines stands. I think there is an index that is produced every year by the Rapporteur Sans Frontières, and Philippines, I think, is number 132 or something like that on it. So you can see where it fits in. But the Philippines has shown an open spirit of cooperation and collaboration by inviting me here. So that I take as a good point, positive point, that they want to hear how well they're doing or where the weaknesses are and where the gaps are. So my answer here is, listen to me, let's talk. I can bring you expertise and experience from other countries as to and solve some of these problems, because without a vibrant, safe, diverse, pluralistic media, citizens suffer. People's right to know is curtailed, and democracy suffers. You are a vibrant democracy, want to preserve your vibrancy, then invest in making your media safe.
Hello. Hi, ma'am. Michael for the News Lens and Pinoy Weekly. Ma'am, I have two quick questions. One is, you mentioned the blocking of alternative media websites earlier, and I'm wondering if there was any discussion with government officials about this and how that went down. And my other question is, if you were able, during your time here, were you able to look into a practice of invoking the anti-terror law to close the bank accounts of certain organizations, of a number of organizations in the Philippines, in a way to sort of stifle their operations?
Yeah. I have, of course, put this in my oral presentation to them. They will receive a written preliminary report, and they will receive a full report with a lot more numbers and statistics and so on about the blocking of the websites. And of course, in some cases, I will also be taking it up with the companies where I have data. I have received lots of written, very well articulated, well documented information from those who have been affected. I have told the government that where I have very concrete information about a violation that has taken place and the individual or the outlet has consented to me for me to use it, I will present it to the government so that they go case by case. We do have a mechanism in the UN for governments to do that, case by case on those cases. So I will know more in the future. With regard to bank accounts, yes, some people have claimed that bank accounts are then frozen, and then, of course, they cannot operate. And that is why I feel that the Anti-Terrorism Act, as it is now framed, does not provide the protection that your Constitution gives you, even in times of insecurity. And that is why I hope the Supreme Court will use the opportunity as cases come up to the court to look at the actual application of the Act.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm John Ray Luciano, College Editors Guild of the Philippines. You have noted in your report that attacks on campus press and academic freedom has devalued the quality of education in this country. And for you, how urgent must the government address attacks against students, campus journalists, and people in the academe? And what action steps could you recommend to the Marcos administration to resolve these attacks?
Well, I think in terms of academic freedom, it is a very simple thing the government has to do. It has to abstain from interfering with academic freedom. Historically, going back thousands of years, I think the idea of education and scholarship has been that there should be some freedom given to them and to students to engage freely in the academic arena. And that is what I think students are asking, and the academics that I've met are also asking, that the state should not send insecurity, state should not start suppressing speech as long as it's not criminal. So they should allow young people to explore new ideas. And I think it's good for the country. Otherwise, you just think of all the things that would never be discovered. Think of Galileo. What would have happened today to us in terms of science? If do we want another Galileo where you are not allowed to have freedom to express and expand and experiment?
Ma'am.
I think there was a gentleman here who's been asking. Yes. Yes.
I think you said earlier that your viewers. In your assessment, is there a, as you said earlier, domestic imperative for the country, the Philippines, to return to the folds of the ICC, or are state agencies truly capable to investigate killings, including that of journalists?
As I said, I don't want to comment on the ICC because I know it's a very controversial subject, and I'm not really. That's really not my. I've not really looked into it. What I will tell you that Philippines is the 8th worst state for impunity. So you know what capacity, resource, or expertise they have in resolving these cases, and that is why, of course, it makes justice, focusing on addressing impunity, a huge imperative for the government domestically or internationally. That's their choice. If they solve, as you know, the first court of recourse is the state. If the state can deal with the situation, then the international machinery does not move in. So what will the state show?
Do you think that the state has shown the capability to investigate these killings?
So far, the state has not done so, as you know from the figures and the statistic that I just gave you. But I'm not in a position to comment as to whether it is appropriate. The ICC case is going on, so I don't know whether it's appropriate or not for Philippines, how to react to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Ellen Cruz from Tokyo Shimbun. You have mentioned the abuses, some of the abuses by the past administration of President Duterte. So do you think it has made significant damage really to the human rights situation, and not only to media, the closure of ABS-CBN, the abuse by the police? And how do you think the government is, you said it's stepping up, but how do you think the government is willing to really upturn the situation?
Well, I think we all know of the huge loss of life, the attacks on people, the violation of human rights that took place during Duterte's regime, including attacks against my peers, other mandate holders who raised issues, and mandate holders, special procedures, were not allowed to come to Philippines during that time. I think what happens when that kind of a administration remains in power for a long time is the mindset of impunity, the mindset of going around the law, the mindset of not applying the rule of law, not caring about protections and safeguards. And that, of course, lingers on long after the administration ends. And that is why my recommendation to the government, to this administration, that you need to send a message out that you do not approve and you will not tolerate red tagging, if that is your position. Because a message from the top will have the same impact on mindset, whether it is a good message or a bad message. The bad message has sunk in. Now the good message has to come strongly from the very top about commitment to human rights and about not tolerating negligence or deliberate violation by state officials.
Okay, we will be taking just 2 more questions, so 1 and...
Ma'am, have you been made aware of some criticisms against your visit in the Philippines, and what can you say about it?
Yes, indeed, I have, and that is why at the end of my presentation to the Department of Foreign Affairs, I looked at the representatives of the Department of Justice, from the President's office, and from Foreign Affairs, and said to them that this is an opportunity for you to educate the people of the Philippines, to educate the media about the role that I play as a special rapporteur, because your government was part of the system that elected me. I am accountable to a system in which your government is a part, so I'm not just a foreigner who walks in and provides my opinion on what is happening here. I have been given a mandate by the member states of the United Nations, which includes the Philippines, to carry out the work that I'm doing, and the government has invited me for it. So the government must now defend. They may not agree with everything I said, that's fair enough. We will have a conversation on that separately, but they must defend me when I'm attacked. Of course I can be criticized, that is freedom of expression, but when I'm attacked, my integrity is attacked, and unfair comments are made. It is the duty of the government, and I was assured by the officials there that indeed they took that seriously.
We have time for 1 more question.
Yes. There's one other issue that is in my report, and I wanted to highlight to you. By the way, my report will be available later today on the website, but was on disinformation. Disinformation, I've heard a lot from the government about disinformation, media, you guys being the source of disinformation. On the other hand, I've heard from people, audiences, your audiences and others, who say that, and civil society and the media itself, who says that there's disinformation either instigated or produced by state officials. And my study, I produced the first report on disinformation in the United Nations system in 2022. And there is now a General Assembly on disinformation. There is a General Assembly resolution on disinformation. There is a UN Human Rights Council resolution on disinformation, and both of them have drawn heavily on my report. And according to my report, the issue of disinformation is an issue of lack of trust. That is how it happens. You don't trust certain sources of information, and then, of course, and that is linked to the fact that governments do produce disinformation. So the first thing the government has to do in this strategy is not to introduce a law to censor fake news. No, I don't. Fake news laws are, I would say, contrary to international law. But what the government must first do is become robust about its own public information. The information that it puts out should be correct, factual, timely, and transparent. That's number one. And then the government should allow diverse sources of information. It is not about truth and lie. Disinformation is rarely about truth and lie. It's about manipulation of information. And most information is not scientifically proven one way or the other. It includes of views, points of views, perspectives, satire, opinion. There are all sorts of things there, information that is evolving. And in that kind of a situation, of course, there should be diverse sources. And one of the best fact checkers is independent media. Media, you as independent professional journalists, if you do your duty well, then you become important fact checkers for people. And there should be diverse sources. Someone may read one editorial and the others will read another different newspaper or an outlet with a different editorial, but people should have access to diverse sources. And the third point is media literacy. Media and digital literacy these days, citizens should know how to manipulate the vast amount of information that we have. Those are the three issues on which the government should invest itself, not in adopting fake news laws, or even worse, accusing media outlets of being fake news, producers of fake news. I think that is extremely damaging because it destroys people's trust in media.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you. That's it for today. Thank you everyone for attending the press conference of Ms. Irene Khan.
Okay.